We have a bunch. So,
Oh, yeah.
yeah, that's right. I guess that's kind of like you ever been looking? What's times, yeah. Everybody in my college, we bought a fishing line there. I went up there. Got here for 12 years. He let me come up for a month as long as I helped out, right? Yeah. Just hang out there, I just buy my own food, but you know. I went up right after I came to Washington. Yeah, and his sister was working in Petersburg. Oh, yeah, that's what I can't. Yeah, exactly. What else are you gonna do? Well, I guess you can go out on the boat. Yeah. Went up by ferry and stayed with her. Skagway. Yeah. It's so weird. Now it's more so covered. Not southeast. Not southeast. Well, this is time. Time because gas prices are up today. Gas prices off to get yourself around $5. That's right. Yeah. Yeah. I'm gonna show you guys how it's done from the back of the room. I'm gonna be watching. I'm gonna fall asleep. What are you talking about? Yeah. I'll feast my eyes on it. All right. Today, we talked about natural gas. We should all watch the video, part 1 of natural gas. And just I'll give a quick review of that. First thing I wanted to notice is the wall are all gray and black. The coal, I did have the blue flame natural gas, so I did find something, and these are actually blue, they're dark blue pants. So did you actually plan all that out? What's that? Did you actually plan all that out? I did. Very difficult. Ordered the shirt now. But as long as it's not Michigan week, I can wear this stuff too. That's the other thing. So anyway, hopefully everyone got to see the video. If not, let me still go back and see it after class, but let me just spend about 2 minutes or so, 5 minutes or so, just kind of going through some of the highlights of that in terms of natural gas. And never forgive us, we don't have a mouse and we don't have a remote. You have your remote? I could start without it, but yeah. Okay. So in the first part, and in terms of the movie video, you got one. Okay, great. We talked about background and supply. So really explaining what natural gas is. A surprising number of people, when you say gas, don't assume natural gas, they think gasoline, which is not. Obviously, it's very different. That work? Let's see. So yeah, okay, good. Works perfectly. And so natural gas went through in the video, mostly methane. Methane is CH4, so your classic hydrocarbon. More hydrogen in gas, of course, than coal. And then a bunch of other stuff, which, as we talked about in the movie, the first section, are a whole bunch of what's called gas liquids, and some carbon dioxide, nitrogen, ethane. So ethane, propane, butane, pentane, as I like to call the amines, are all natural gas liquids, and they're actually processed from natural gas One, to sort of remove them as impurities and remove also things like sulfur from the gas as well. There's only a little bit in natural gas, but there's some. And takes out some of the oxygen, CO2, some of the other elements directly in the gas. And it produces something called pipeline quality gas. So rather than understanding all the details of how that's done, and what that does to the constituents of natural gas, the most important thing is it really turns it into these days closer to a 95% methane product. So it's mostly pure natural gas. And that allows natural gas to be really one commodity. And that's really important in the markets. So whether you produce natural gas in West Virginia or Pennsylvania, or whether you produce natural gas in Texas, it all ends up in the pipeline as basically the same commodity. So it can trade as if it's an equivalent commodity. So in the markets for energy trading, very important that it's a single commodity. While coal, which we learned about last week, not that way at all. There are different types of coal, and they really have different characteristics. And because of that, they actually are priced very different. Okay, and this got into some of the details of moving natural gas, including putting hydrogen sulfide in it so that a odorless methane has an odor. So people know when there's a gas leak, very important. Okay. And then we went through the whole production cycle, talked about the types of production, gas fracking technology, sort of conventional production, which is on the decline, while the gas fracking has been on an increase over the last couple of decades. And then we talked about environmental impacts. I'm not going to belabor that too much, except to say that the assessments that EPA has done has generally found, while there can be some instances where there can be problems, in general, as long as this is done properly, as long as the fracking is done properly, there aren't problems with drinking water, which is their biggest concern. And then we went through where the gas is produced. This is fairly old picture that EIA had back more than a decade ago. Guess what? It turns out that for conventional fields, that really hasn't changed much because there isn't a lot of conventional gas drilling going on anymore. And then the shale plays, though, is the newer one. And we talk about the production being in some of the Gulf shales, but the fast growing shales, particularly in Pennsylvania, Eastern Ohio, West Virginia, the Marcellus Shale, and even some out west, such as the Bakken shales, et cetera. Now, some of these, of course, produce oil as well as gas. Some of them mostly produce oil rather than gas, and vice versa. So it sort of depends. But that gives you an idea that the map is a little different in terms of where natural gas is produced than it was 20 years ago. And then we gave you a little chart of the pipeline system, and I talk more about the pipeline hubs in part 2. But suffice to say that this pretty elaborate system that's been built up over time, starting with very small intrastate pipeline systems that eventually became these large interstate systems where gas gets moved literally thousands of miles. And then some of the production numbers, the fact that that green area where, which is the tight shale gas versus the more conventional onshore and even some offshore gas, those have been in decline. Shale has been the big increase. And then how much it'll go up or even maybe flatten out or go down will be dependent on pricing of natural gas, high and low supply cases, which is high price case, low price case, basically. And that makes a big difference on how much gas is used, how many gas plants are built, that type of thing. And a little more on where that shale is coming from. Okay, so part two, we're going to pick up where we left off. We talked a lot about supply, background on gas, what it is. And now it's time to sort of pivot to talking about regulation of natural gas. And obviously we talked about potential environmental regulation. We talked about fracking in part one, but this is about price regulation and what its history has been and how that's influenced gas and how gas has been produced. Obviously demand, big one to learn with the electric side is that the demand for gas from the electric sector has gone up quite a bit in the last 10 to 15 years, and it's projected to continue to go up. So that's a big portion of demand. But the markets, and with the markets, it's sort of what's the pricing been, and how do the prices move, and why do they move the way they move? What characterizes a commodity like natural gas in terms of its pricing and cycles, if you will, boom bust cycles that actually occur. Okay, so start out with a brief history of natural gas. Natural gas business, although this is sort of cheating because it's not really true natural gas, but the first gas, as in methane, that was used was actually manufactured natural gas. And believe it or not, back in 1816, they extracted natural gas from coal and used that for street lamps. So you had gas street lamps in Baltimore in 1860. Now, in the late 70s and 80s, until it lost any allure, there was something called synfuels that was going on in the US, and it became one of those programs that kept getting funding. And the idea was, in the 70s, we were concerned about oil, OPEC oil, shortages of oil, high prices of oil, to a lesser extent, but we were also concerned about natural gas and its relatively high prices and limitations. So synfuels was a way to extract natural gas, or in some cases oil, literally, using coal as its sort of feedstock. The whole experiment, after it was subsidized for, I don't know, how long did it last, Brent? I think it was like 15 years before it really finally died. And they kept putting money into it. And guess what they found out? It was too expensive to do. Much cheaper to just get the natural gas. And it turned out what was really much cheaper to do was to decontrol price caps in the natural gas business. And once they did that, gas supply boomed.
Did Strickland also have a program for that more recently?
There is some things where you can use coal byproducts, not really natural gas, but right. So that they call that synfuels. I guess that's sort of.
Administration put much money into that. I remember there was a lot of discussion and research about this was obviously before 2006 to 2010 period.
Yeah, it kind of always rears its head periodically, it seems like.
Oil prices are high.
Yeah.
So it'll come back. It'll come back.
Yes, exactly. So anyway, so this was sort of the first official use of a methane product. We won't call it true natural gas, manufactured natural gas, as we called it at the time. But then you started to see actual ability to drill for natural gas. Your first natural gas well in Fredonia, New York, which is just outside of Buffalo. I can really date myself, and Brent will remember what movie Fredonia was mentioned. Maybe he doesn't remember. This is an old Marx Brothers movie, but they actually created a mythical country in the movie called Fredonia. But anyway, I digress here. I'm getting a lot of shaking of heads like, no, I've never heard that.
Well, have you told them why you're a famous author yet?
What's that?
Have you told them why you're a famous author yet?
My famous,
Have you told the class that you're a famous author?
oh, no, I certainly haven't. I will do that at some future class. How about that? So you had a gas well, and you really had gas production kind of going very slowly. It got used in a few instances, sort of this type of street lamps and other things, but no really major use of gas until you started seeing some of these major developments, particularly on the industrial side, which later became something that got used in the commercial and residential side, and that was the Bunsen burner, which any of you in science classes? Yeah, so Bunsen burner is kind of essential in that. It became essential in any kind of applications you needed to do, kind of rapid heating of something. And then eventually found its way into residential commercial applications as well. So that was kind of the first, and obviously not the last, many more applications as we had over time. So we got into the early 1900s. We started to see a few of the first natural gas power plants being built. Really not until probably the 1920s were some of the first ones. And it became a bigger deal as the pipeline systems started to expand from these very narrow, small pipeline systems where, you'd have a city or a town which was near natural gas and simply pull the gas up and pipe it right to the town. Now you had these more broader intrastate and then interstate systems for natural gas, like I showed on that map earlier. And so one of the concerns began to be, hey, the states are taking care of what they want to do at the state level for that gas that's sold intrastate, but there really was no one taking care of interstate sale of gas. And there was concern with these pipelines that they had kind of a monopoly position, let's call it that. They could kind of control where the production, their pipeline would take it from where the production is to the demand centers, and the demand centers wouldn't necessarily have other options or other alternatives to get the gas, or certainly not to transport the gas. So with the Natural Gas Act, during the FDR administration and the sort of the New Deal process, they created a regulation of sale and transport of interstate natural gas. Not so much with price controls or anything like that, but really more keeping an eye on that behavior and making sure that you weren't seeing a lot of price gouging, that type of thing. And the agency did was the Federal Power Commissions, which was the earliest version, if you will, of the Department of Energy. But that was only until about 50 years later, or excuse me, 40 years later. We go out over time, get into the early 1950s. You have this issue with interstate gas again, and there was still this concern that would actually could be regulated, so the wellhead production could be regulated. So you're keeping an eye on the pipelines, but now you wanted to keep an eye on the producers and what they could charge. And typically the producers and the pipelines could be often one and the same. So you had this Natural Gas Act where you said, okay, now I'm going to regulate wellhead production for the interstate markets. This was driven really in '54 by a Supreme Court decision called the Phillips decision that basically gave the Federal Power Commission the ability to regulate production destined for interstate markets. So what happened was, is you started to see real price caps at that point. They were to try and limit how much prices could grow. Initially, it wasn't a big deal. You know, gas production was going up. Gas demand was starting to go up. But the cost of getting gas out wasn't going up that much. So these price limits weren't really that binding. But as you got in the later 50s and particularly in the 60s, you started seeing more soaring demand because these price limits had kept prices, or put a lid on prices. So supply was there, but prices were low, so there was a lot of demand. And eventually, of course, that led to an imbalance. There was inadequate supply. The real driver of that was kind of the inflation spiral that hit in the late 60s and particularly the early 1970s, where you had the OPEC cutbacks, the oil price increases, and this interstate price regulation on oil and gas resulted literally in declining production. So what happened was, this was the period where a term was coined, not so jokingly, which was that, you know, those Texans down there were just trying to freeze a Yankee when it came to how they would be willing to supply natural gas. Although the truth was, because the price was limited, right? There was a lot of demand, price wasn't allowed to go up with this interstate production. The Texas gas folks, the Louisiana gas folks, they were all doing what was very logical, right? From a business sense, they were going to say, okay, well, I can sell in-state and I can get whatever price I need to get. If I sell interstate, I get this much lower price. Where am I going to sell? Pretty obvious, right? So you had this very difficult imbalance. You started to get issues about gas availability, particularly in the peak demand periods. And at that time, there wasn't a lot of use of gas for power. In fact, there was congressional legislation, Fuel Use Act, things like that, that actually did not allow power plants to use natural gas. Now, it was somewhat limited. It didn't in all situations, but it certainly put a damper on the amount of natural gas that was used by the power sector. That meant that you had this really high demand occurring in the winter months when it was heating load, and much less in the summer. And that's when you see all the shortages and some of the problems in the system. So what happened? Well, we had inflation through the 70s and into the early 80s. We got a number of policies, obviously, which eventually drove inflation down. And part of it also was there was a desire by FERC, who now kind of took over the roles of the old FPC, was sort of the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. They had a couple of orders that actually unbundled gas from pipelines and storage. It meant that you, if you were a municipal gas utility for Boston, you could shop for your gas and you could specifically buy the gas, and then you could arrange delivery separate from that. And by this time, one of the good news was you started to see more pipelines. So there was actually more competition in the way you could move gas. So that was one thing that helped. And another thing that helped is eventually they said, all right, let's get rid of this wellhead control, decontrol prices. And you saw the results, and we'll show kind of the history here. If you look at, again, the early days, not a lot of uses for gas. Started getting into the 30s, you started to see some power plants, other uses. You started actually seeing the beginnings of natural gas used in the residential and commercial sectors for heating. Up until then, it had been, in some cases, literally a lot of wood burning. In other cases, some electric heat. And so you saw a big increase in demand, literally quadrupling in 2 decades. A big increase, right? But as I mentioned, these price controls began to fight. They began to fight as we got into the mid-70s, early 70s. And the interstate gas production, certainly those wellheads that were deemed where their gas was destined for interstate markets. If they couldn't switch to an intrastate market, they tended to just say, and stop producing, and certainly stop drilling for gas in those areas. So that led to a decline in production. And mind you, this was all happening as prices were going up for all the alternatives to gas, like oil was going way up. Companies had to use heating oil more often, and it was cost, 3 times as much as it cost, 5 years earlier. So it wasn't a pretty picture. But then as we saw these unbundling and then decontrol, certainly in this period, you see what ultimately happened. It takes that takes you out to about 2010, and of course, surging.
That was the era when we had great faith in our government because they gave us regulations that caused production to go down, prices to go up, and they created new regulations that caused production to go down, prices to go up, and they created new regulations.
Yeah.
So they finally got rid of regulations, and then prices went down, and prices went up.
Prices went down and production went up.
That's what we love about our government.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. It was an interesting period, and we don't even get into here what they were doing on oil. You think natural gas price control is one thing. Well, oil price control was probably one of the most complicated systems you can imagine, where they had what they called new oil and old new oil. There were all these classifications, and depending on the classification, they had a different price. And so anyway. Okay, so one of the things that,
Were the price controls effective? I remember you said that it was originally if I'm hearing right, it was originally to break up potential monopolies that would just raise the prices because they could. And obviously because there wasn't enough demand at that time for it to be a problem like it was in the 70s, from the 30s perspective where they were, was that actually an effective policy in its prime?
In part, yes. The thing with the price controls, and this is kind of the analogy is where we are with electricity today. With electricity today, we have a system where there are set tariffs, and you can't charge more than that full 100% tariff for moving electricity. And that's because the transmission provider typically has a monopoly or a near monopoly on moving that power. So they do that. And then what happens is, because a lot of the system is in place and you're not seeing a lot of new capital for new transmission systems, you're seeing some, but not very much. When demand is low, they're allowed to discount, and they do commonly. So you see, a price of maybe $3 a megawatt hour is the price to move electricity, and then they discount below that. But you notice that's just regulating the transmission. It's not regulating the cost of the generation and price that's charged at the generator, if you will. So that was kind of the analogy here, where initially the suppliers and the transmitters or transporters of natural gas were one and the same, and they were bundled together. And so as they kind of undid this, they unbundled the two as well to create competition in each part of the cycle. You still have some regulation. Most of it relates to the distribution system, but for the most part, it's deregulated. Did it work? It's always a trade-off. If you try and put in, kind of price controls you've got to be pretty sure that you're not setting that too low. Because if you set it too low, then whoever's, producing the gas or moving the gas decides, well, I can't do this, doesn't make any sense. And you certainly can't give them other options. So that was kind of the weird part, was that they were regulating interstate gas and interstate gas prices, but not intrastate gas. So I don't know if that really answers your question, but I guess in the early days, there was some logic in what they were doing, certainly in the 30s, where they said we better keep an eye on this. But when they got into hard price caps, it became much more binding. Then they reached that problem of, good old supply demand curve, and you're trying to tilt it in a certain way, and you're going to end up reducing production. Yep. Okay. So one of the things I was mentioning is boom bust cycles. We talked about the fact that last week about coal, that there's really, there's some increases in prices. And I mentioned the fact that all energy prices have been going up a lot in the last 6 months, certainly, as we've moved into the reopening, and we've seen demand after having dropped so much now bouncing back. And even in the coal business, there was some cutbacks in production, things like that. But while all of those have been moving up, natural gas really is a more classic commodity following this boom bust cycle. And the way it works is, right, natural gas prices rise in response to greater demand. Producers turn around and say, we better go look for more gas, explore more. In the old days, that was literally, you had to, go to a new property, put in a new drilling rig. It actually took time, it took capital, but you were willing to do it if you saw these prices rising. You said, hey, there's demand, prices are going up. So then a year or 6 months or 2 years, depending on the cycle, later, the production increases enough that it eventually starts to overtake demand. So now we have all the supply that's coming in, and all of a sudden, demand is overtaken by supply, so your prices fall. So then demand increases and supply falls in response to the lower prices, right? So demand has continued to go up. These prices are falling off, but now demand increases. These low prices, supply falls, because now you cut back that production. And that in turn does what? Leads you back to step one, right? So it's a cycle. And this cycle historically for natural gas is a little hard to trace because there are a lot of other convening factors. You might say it takes several years, typically from the beginning to the end of a cycle. But when you throw in the effects of oil prices, which oddly have the opposite effect on gas prices. And why is that? If oil prices go up a lot, partly what we're now seeing with the recovery, oil prices have gone up. What happens? Well, not only do oil producers go in and drill more, there are a lot of oil producers, as we mentioned early in the first part of this lecture about the type of gas that you get. Some of the gas is what's called associated gas. And that means if they drill for oil, they look for oil and find gas. And they find oil too, usually. So they find both. And they say, hey, we better, we'll bring this gas into the market. So if oil prices were low, as they were in 2020, what happened? Well, we cut back on a lot of production. But low oil prices meant we also ended up cutting back on gas supply as well, right? So that tended to make these a little more complicated with this whole associated gas part of the cycle. And it's kind of the length of the cycles. I mentioned the last cycle was about a decade long. Those of you who have reviewed the PowerPoint already, not to say you had to, but had to review this PowerPoint, you would notice I changed the last bullet point just today, because it was a little bit old. I said we were emerging from just emerging now from a long-term bus cycle. Well, we're in a boom cycle now, right? Natural gas prices, literally a year ago, I want to say maybe it's more like 9 months ago, were below $2. They're only about $1.50 in some cases. I think that was their last fall. And now it's over $5. So that's quite a boom. It's a big increase. And again, this is the driver, right? So what do we expect will happen now? Given the prices are going up, well, we've seen already the rigs, the drilling numbers, and I kind of track it every week to week, have been going down during 2020, and then 2021 start to turn back up again. So what's that going to do? Eventually, it should overtake demand, and then we'll be looking at prices declining. Yeah.
Is there like usually a timeline for how long like the boom bust cycle like lasts?
Well, there's probably an average timeline you could look at it, but the variance is pretty big. And there are a lot of things that complicate it. One was I mentioned the associated gas production. So it's also part of the oil price picture as well as the gas price picture. Another part of it is that you had boom bust cycles in the pre-shale gas period, and those tended to be longer because the lead times were longer. It took much longer to sort of stop the drilling and the production, or in other terms, increase that drilling and production, because you literally had to put in new rigs and things like that. With a lot of the fracking, they may have opened up a fracking field and they just go to another part of the field and do more production from another part of that field. And they can do that a lot more quickly. Still going to take a matter of months, but it's not going to be a matter of years. So I guess my answer is depends on some of those conditions as well as are going on. Here's a map that is as you can tell, another fairly old map, a 12-year-old map. But it's showing the natural gas centers and hubs relative to the transportation corridors. And what I like about this is it actually shows how big some of these pipelines are. In other words, this width is the relative size of those pipelines. And you can see a lot of the central location is Henry Hub. That's kind of the main trading point for natural gas here in Louisiana. So right there. And you can see big wide stuff. There's a lot of pipelines that go up into the Midwest and go eventually east, where it's going to. It's all the population centers, where most of the gas consumption is. Some goes to Florida. And then you have some production out west, which tends to go to various markets out west, including California. Used to have more gas production in California, basically have very little now. So it's not as the pipelines aren't. Pipelines are going out. Most of them are going out. That gives you some idea of kind of the transportation corridors. Now you might say, well, this is an old map. You know, it's 2008. It must be really different now. It's not, right? Because building a gas pipeline is a big deal. Building pretty much anything that involves like a highway or a pipeline or electricity transmission line, all those things are extremely difficult to do. And they're very expensive because you've got, environmental impact statements, you've got, you've got to get all these different approvals from usually multiple federal agencies and state agencies, I might add. And so the process takes a long time. And so as a result, there tends to be a discouraging of wanting to build more pipelines and stuff. I'm not saying that's bad. I'm just saying that's the reality. That's how it works. So there have been a few pipeline additions since this map, but only a few, and nowhere near as large as what existed in 2008. Here's just a nice supply and disposition flow chart. And what trying to get here, this is 2020. So, okay, this is a COVID year, so the numbers are lower than normal, right? You'll see, particularly in a couple of different areas, but you've got gas that comes from natural gas wells. That's the conventional gas only, drill for gas production. Then you got all this shale gas, right? That's the big chunk of it, more than 70–80% of it. And then look, there's your associated gas, not insignificant, from crude oil wells. So that impacts the markets. Obviously, when there's more oil drilling, there's going to be more associated gas production. And even a little bit from coal bed wells, which is gas taken from coal beds, coal mines. Methane is produced naturally in those mines. For a while, that was produced and not produced, but simply vented. And it still is in some of these mines because there's not enough of collection of it. Needless to say, you don't want an underground coal mine with a lot of methane gas, right? Very explosive. So that's why they vent that out. Plus, it's very harmful too. You don't want to be breathing pure methane for very long. So, so at any rate, those are the big productions. Then you have the gross withdrawals. Some of it goes back, right? Some of it involves a tiny bit of venting and flaring. That number's been going down and down and down because it's in the interest of the producers to try and squeeze out as much gas as they can. So they try not to vent and flare any of the excess gas. But some gets vented and flared, still a small percentage. Some goes into repressuring. You literally put the gas back into the wells themselves. In case of storage, when it's full out of storage, you might repressure the storage, like taking some out, but also pushing some back in. And so then you have this sort of net, which is a marketed production. There's the dry gas production. And then there's this NGPL production. That comes out actually before this marketed production. That's natural gas liquids. NGPL. And then you've got a portion, a growing portion, is being exported. Now, some of that export isn't really the export you might think. It's not gas that's going to Japan or something through LNG. It's instead going to Canada or Mexico. It's really through the pipeline system. But an increasing portion is going and getting loaded on these very special barges, which take the liquefied gas and then bring it, ship it across, and then repressurize it, get to their location, so they have natural gas again, which then gets used. And a lot of that's going to Asia. Some is going to Europe. Some of it went to Europe because Vladimir Putin had a way of making Europeans very worried about whether they would have gas in the winter. He kind of controlled the pipelines. It still does. So that was kind of a backstop for some people. So we've got to have another source of supply. And then all this goes to dry gas production and consumption. And then the big numbers, one, of course, historically, electric power was never the #1 fuel until the last 5 or 6 years. And it's now the #1 use of natural gas. Industrial second, residential, commercial third. Those are the big three. A little bit in transportation, right? There's some natural gas buses out there, pressurized natural gas. So that's it's been a kind of a growing segment, but still not a very big number relative to all the others. And here's a picture of this consumption over time. And as I mentioned, you can see the building of a lot of gas, new gas sources. There were, the lower gas prices meant that gas was displacing coal. And so you see this rapid increase until we got to 2019. Then we got into 2020 when we had a big fall off. Huge reduction, obviously, in the first several months of the pandemic, but it lasted for much of 2020, where demand was lower than 2019. Started to pick up in the fall last year. And so you saw the effect of that in the other sectors. Commercial, residential went down. Not as much as electric went down. It's a little bit hard to read this graph because you're looking at this difference, and that's fairly flat. And why was that? Well, because there's a lot of heating demand in commercial buildings and residential buildings. And as some of you have noted in a prior class, I had some students note this last year, you've got sort of two things that are going on. One was commercial demand in commercial buildings went down, right? Why? Well, no one's going to work anymore. So, companies were not heating their buildings up to 72 degrees anymore. They were probably kept them on and you keep the systems running, but probably had it at 60 or something. It's probably cool in there for the people who did come in. So you had that effect, but then the flip side was all these people hanging out at home all day, right? So they were cranking up their heat where they maybe normally didn't have it quite as high during the day. So that was probably what went on there. And then you see, this is both the residential and commercial sectors. That kind of is the point more. This is fairly flat when you look at it. But the overall trend, so we don't focus too much on COVID and what it did to 1 year, is that after COVID, this is EIA's projection, is it'll go up. I think it's already ahead of this pace. But I have to double check that. It has started to snap back. But one thing that is happening is now that gas prices have really soared in the last few months, now you're starting to see coal starting to come back, leading to gas, and gas dropping off. So we'll see how that ends up at the end of the year. We haven't had gas at these high levels for more than a couple of months, but it certainly could make a difference going through the year. Yeah.
What's liquefaction?
What's that?
What's liquefaction?
Liquefaction is taking natural gas and turning it into a liquid, which then in turn is used for export. So you liquefy the gas and you put it on those ships, send it across, and then regasify it when it gets to the port in Japan or wherever it is. That shouldn't be that's a pretty small number. I'm not positive, to be honest, whether this is losses associated with liquefaction or whether that's the actual liquefied BTUs. Either way, it's not a big number.
So I was looking up, trying to figure out on our website whether that increase in refuse. And so unfortunately, only have data through the second quarter of the year, so prices really picked up in the last quarter. So.
Right, it's really been third quarter.
Anyone's from that area from Eastern Ohio, I mean, I gotta imagine that people are starting to come back into the area and start to work on that area.
Right, probably so. I would think so. Okay. Another important thing about natural gas, I've been alluding to it, is that natural gas use has been highly seasonal. And I say has been because it's still seasonal, but not as seasonal as it was. I'll explain why in a second. But here's sort of the history of the early 2000s to 2014. And you look at this is the consumption. And literally, mark, these points are all, December, January on every year, right? So it gets real cold, everyone turns on the heat. The companies turn on the heat, the residences turn on the heat, the industrial factories turn on the heat, everyone turns on the heat at the same time. And when it's in March or April, there's no electric load, there's no, or not no, but there's more limited electric load, there's more limited heating load. And so you get some of the low numbers in that kind of spring, fall time period. For a long time, you notice this little thing here, that's fun. It actually didn't do it much after then. But if we had extended this out, what we'd start to see is a second peak. And you get the second peak because now natural gas consumption from electricity has gotten really high. And of course, electricity demand very high in the summer, right? So there's actually a peak of consumption, still not as high as the winter because the winter's in every sector, right? But, electric, might do this or something, right? So what's also interesting about this is you look at this, it's a little hard to tell through the area on the curve, the graph, but you do see that production has some fluctuation, but stays pretty constant, right? And during months of the year, obviously over time, it's been growing. So that leads to the question, what the heck is going on in these months? How the heck is demand being met if the production is so much lower than demand in January? Well, the answer is natural gas storage. And this is developed over a number of years. Again, this is 2015, that's not too bad, about 5 years ago. Gives you a picture of where gas storage is. The most common is using a depleted gas field, right? Pull gas out of the ground. There's, in effect, space in the rock to shove some of the gas back in, pressurize it, and where some of those repressurizing numbers come from in the consumption. And that becomes a natural storage facility. But you also have things like salt caverns, aquifers, and those are not water reservoirs. They're what they call brine aquifers. They're areas where there was water, typically underground, or always underground, I should say, but they're unfit to drink. It's not drinking water. So they use those aquifers and pressurize some gas in there. But most of it, again, you can see by the number of sites, the depleted fields, the salt caverns, and aquifers, less so. Yeah.
Just out of geographical curiosity, why does Illinois have so many aquifers? I know that's the Great Salt Lake is in Utah. What's going on with Illinois?
Yeah, well, apparently they must have a lot of underground water. I'm not honestly sure why it worked out that way. It may have been, one of the things is a lot of this had to do with the options available when they were sort of building up their storage over time. And so historically, it may have been easier, back in the day to use depleted fields and salt caverns. And so when a lot of the initial gas was being developed, it was happening here, but then Illinois was a little later where they were deciding to use. Now, the other thing that's going on is Illinois, part of the answer to your question is Illinois doesn't produce much gas. Right, it's very little from Illinois. It's really all from Appalachia. Notice all the depleted fields, the Gulf, some out west. You can see some old stuff in California, which doesn't produce much anymore, but did. That's a really good question. I'll have to look that one up. Okay, so one of the things this leads to the obvious point. All right, so you have these gas storage facilities, and what gas storage allows you to do, put the gas in when demand is low, prices are low, and then hopefully, if you're someone running one of the storage facilities, you do kind of an arbitrage on that. You put it in low, pull it out in the winter when the price is higher, right? And of course, it's also a natural way to deal with this peak in demand, using storage to deal with peak, the energy peak. Another way in which sort of the market has arrived at dealing with some of the volatility, if you will, in supply and demand, particularly demand that occurs in the winter, is that the pipeline companies who sell the gas, who ship the gas, if you will, offer two types of contracts. The first is a firm contract, which guarantees delivery regardless of conditions. I know what you're saying, what happened in Texas, stuff like that. What happened in Texas is those that weren't able to deliver because of that paid a huge financial penalty because of that, and will. Part of the agreement is that just you can't force majeure this other than paying an enormous amount of money. So it's basically you're saying I'm willing to pay more for my gas under a firm gas contract arrangement, so that I know when I have demanded, you have the capacity to give it to me. Whether it's in coldest day in February or not, I'm gonna get my gas. Interruptible contracts don't guarantee, right? So you have a gas contract, but it's interruptible. It gets to be very cold in February. Pipeline says, sorry, we're cutting you off. You don't get gas. They try not to do that very much. Obviously, in some years, they don't do it all. Depends kind of on the winter, a lot of conditions, all that type of stuff. So this, you don't have capacity. Remember, we were talking about capacity in the electric sector. Same kind of concept, but for gas. Here I own capacity, so I should get the gas regardless. Here I don't. So I may, in a good year, I won't have any problem. But every so often, every several years, you may get interrupted. And the interruptions typically won't be more than a few days a year when it happens, but it certainly can happen. So you pay lower, right? You should pay less for that. And you did. So firm customers own or have a call on pipeline capacity. We've done the energy trading part. Is that coming up next week? Okay. All right. You'll learn a little bit about, when you watch the energy trading, a little about what call is. But really it means someone has a call by be willing to pay more so they have capacity if they're a firm customer. Interruptible customers don't have that. So who gets firm gas contracts and who gets interruptible contracts? Well, pretty clearly, firm gas contracts are people that say are entities who say, boy, I better have it all the time. If I don't have it all the time, it's going to be terrible, right? You're going to have what happened in Texas. There's several from that week, literally. Local distribution companies generally serve residential and commercial customers And they usually buy the firm gas from the pipeline. They're serving hospitals, schools, homes, a lot of businesses who want to have their stores open all the time, all that kind of stuff. And so the bulk of gas is under firm contract. But the large industrial electric power companies don't typically have firm gas contracts. Now, one thing that started to change is the electric power companies, right? Large industrial, typically, they may say, hey, we're willing to pay only so much more for gas to be sure we have it all the time, because the value of having our factory open, every day of the year, even in an interruptible day, is worth it. But a lot of them look at it and say, it's all right. We cut production a couple of days out of the year. We can live with that and save a lot of money. So you get a lot of the large industrials doing that. Electric power companies used to be that it was no big deal, right? Again, when were you going to get interrupted? February, January, real cold. Well, okay, electric demand goes up when it's real cold. You have electric heat. Gas demand goes up more. But back 20 years ago, there wasn't a lot of gas serving load. Even 10 years ago, there still wasn't that much. Yeah, all of a sudden, gas is key in power plants. And you need that electricity. So you start seeing a lot of these companies changing how they're doing it. To some extent, you're seeing also electric power companies having kind of emergency fuel in their system. So, for example, if I'm gonna have a combined cycle, I design it to make sure I can run it on distillate oil as well as natural gas, which you can do. The distillate's a pretty clean oil, and it won't mess up a combined cycle, particularly if you're only going to do it, one day out of the year, 2 days out of the year. So you start to see some of them backstop that way, but you've also seen a few even go as far as say, yeah, we'll buy firm contracts. We don't want to get interrupted. All right, quick thing on prices. We mentioned price trends. This is, I believe, monthly. It's either monthly or weekly prices. I should have labeled it accordingly. At any rate, you get a lot of volatility in prices in the winter. Before the days of a lot of fracking and when you had gas production that couldn't respond very quickly, you had some real doozy of peaks. Some of them actually related to a lead up right before the big 2008 recession. And then of course you see this impact where as we hit the COVID recession in the early months, all the way out to about, mid-year 2020, prices were below $2. And then you can see it started happening. This doesn't have the last couple of months where it's going up to here, right? So interesting sort of price trends that occur. One of the other points from this graph is again an idea about why for a long time, and still to some extent, you get a lot of electric utilities who sort of grudgingly have recognized that gas is the cheapest source of power for them, typically, and have built more gas or bought more gas, gas-produced electricity from the grid, et cetera. But they also remember this. And they remember how volatile it is. And they remember how much that makes their customers hate them. Quite literally. Because they're simply, they're buying gas month to month, and all of a sudden they're paying $14 for natural gas. And by the way, this is at Henry Hub. This is the main hub. This doesn't even count all the additional transmission costs, which are kind of in these years end up being pretty astronomical. So if they were doing this month to month and they were, had customers who were on a month to month billing arrangement, not so much residential customers, but a lot of industrial customers certainly. All of a sudden they're handing them bills for 3 times what they paid last month. They're not going to be too happy. Yeah.
What caused the spikes in 2001, 2004, 2008, and prices of natural gas are supposed to be increasing at a slow rate, correct?
Yeah, prices have been kind of in this range, go all the way back into the 90s. Prices after sort of deregulation kind of stayed fairly low. They were in this $2 to $3 range. And then all of a sudden around 2000, things changed. 2 things happened. One, you had demand was really surging, starting to surge for a lot of uses, a lot of industrial gas. That was driving it. The other was you had a period of time where utilities had their first surge at building a lot of natural gas generators. That occurred in the late 90s. And so prices of gas were going up because of that. And then you had the first big recession of the 2000s. So there was a shock. Some of these were summer. A few of these actually, I believe this one is Katrina.
On the first one, 2000, the previous year, you both the one was the West.
Yeah.
I thought he had an argument in there that he said that in part Enron drove prices up. There was some speculative behavior that likely actually, there wasn't proof, I thought, in some court cases that Enron through some behavior was actually able to have an impact on prices at that point, right?
Yes, I think that's true. You had a combination of pretty high demand. You also had what was going on in California right here.
Yeah.
And so California had all these rules in their market system, which were kind of a mess. And because of that, you actually create all these odd behavioral things in terms of how you can price power, which also moved over into gas. A lot of the power in the market in California was gas. So yeah, there was a lot of stuff going on. I've never really totally dissected the actual prices. And keep in mind, when you see these needle peaks, those are like a week. Yeah. All right. So yeah, get that. But as far as the price over the course of the year, it's only a small part of the average. But my point is just that you get this volatility for a lot of different reasons. And as I said, one is 2006. Yeah.
From 2004 then, 2009, was that increased regulation? Is that why prices went up?
No.
No.
No, there was just a lot of, again, you had a lot of things going on in the oil markets that affected the gas markets. You had a period where oil prices were going through the roof during the same period, but that was affecting gas. As oil prices go up, gas prices often get driven up too. But you also had a point of this decade, you had a lot of demand generated. I mean, we built, more houses, more new residential homes, commercial buildings than we ever built before in like this 5-year period, leading up to 6-7-year period. And there's a lot of inherent demand for gas. And this was a little before we had the shale revolution. Shale revolution really didn't start until here. Started to see the effects of it in 2010. Obviously, the recession really brought the prices back down. So yeah, and you had what Brent was saying, you had a lot of speculation in a lot of areas going on in this economy. right? We had people believing that, you know, everyone should have a home. I can remember, you know, George Bush is sort of his 2004 campaign was it's going to be an ownership society. Everyone should own, right? Everyone should own their own home. Which, if you think about it, is kind of crazy, right? I mean, people can own a home over time to build up equity. They can do that. But to say everyone as an adult should have a home or own a home, no matter what their financial condition is, doesn't make a lot of sense. But a lot of the policies were to push a lot of home ownership, pushed a lot of demand, pushed a lot of price going up, and it's kind of a byproduct of that. So,
Yeah, you alluded to it, but I don't think you realize the size of the average home in the US went up from about 1,000 square feet in the 1950s to this new home that was built to be 700 square feet.
yeah, it's almost 3,000 square feet.
That's the average, right? So
Yeah,
that, you're heating many more square feet, right?
Yep.
And it's also additional, just a lot of other things that are driving up the heat.
well, and again, a lot of what happened too is that people had a long decade of being very insensitive to gas. Gas was cheap. It was always $2. You know, and all of a sudden it's $5 gold, $6 gold, right?
And the prices are increasing, right? For natural gas.
They have been going up and going down. I guess is a good way to describe it. In the 90s, they came down from the 80s levels. In the 2000s, they went back up. Then they came back down and still, and now we're seeing prices increasing. But I wouldn't want to bet on prices continuing to increase for very long because we're seeing supply response. And I will confess, Brent knows this, I used to play around with a very small part of my, fortunately, a very small part of my investment savings for retirement and everything else with natural gas futures. And you know, I teach futures and options. I've abandoned.
So that was the shortest market right now. Everybody's very,
Yeah, right, exactly. Listen to what I'm doing, I'm doing the opposite. So, yeah, so it's anyone's guess how far prices will continue to go up. There's, you know, a lot of people say, oh, this is just a beginning, gas will get to $10 again. There's some people will say, yeah, this is the end. Well, supply and demand, right? Okay. We talked about this with electricity. Natural gas is kind of the fuel of choice for new power generation. And again, to be clear, as we talked about the cost of electricity, you can clearly come up with numbers for renewables that are cheaper than a natural gas plant. But if you're building a power plant and you want also to have capacity, then the renewable doesn't do so well on that part of the comparison. So that's kind of why you see the majority of capacity being built is natural gas. You do see the remaining portion being all renewables, right? Pretty much wind and solar is on someone's graphs. So there's clearly a future. We've seen the effect of all this gas coming in. A lot of it displacing coal. So from a CO2 perspective, that's one of the reasons we've seen that. And we'll get into this more with the CO2 lectures, but we've seen a 25, 30% drop in CO2 emissions from the electric sector. That's because of this. A lot of this, not all, but most of it. And even at $3 to $4, no, I did not take this slide. I'm not sure I would say even at $5. But even at $3, $4, they're preferable because you have that capacity. That doesn't mean you don't build renewables, and it depends on the state you're in, the conditions. Prices of gas do vary regionally, right? They're not identical in every region. Clearly, where you're producing gas, the closer you are to where the that's being produced, price is going to tend to be lower. You don't have any transmission charges, etc. And then one thing that happened up until COVID is we had certainly a renaissance in petrochemical industry and other gas using industry in the US, which had really been going down for years, and gas prices have been low enough. All of a sudden it's like, wow, there's a pretty economic business. So here's the last chart, which is, I may have showed this one before in the electric lecture, but maybe not, which kind of gives you a sense of here's natural gas, now about 40% of US electricity generation. The percentage is about the same as it was in 2019, even though there was COVID, because gas fell off, but coal fell off too. Everything fell off. Certainly gas and coal mostly. And then you can see here the growth area that UCIA projects by 2050. So renewables are going to double their share, which, by the way, remember, there's more demand here than here. It means renewables may be going up by a factor of 3 or even 4 times by 2050. Now, this is not with any carbon neutrality policy or anything else, not policy driven. This is just what they see with the economics and what they see with the economics going forward. And whatever policies are already in the books, because there are some states that already have policies, like California. Questions? Maybe back to that. Yeah.
Do you think that renewables are gonna, to put it plain, be able to handle that kind of share? Like, do you think they're gonna be able to
Well,
build that many renewable facilities and like, I don't know, what are your opinions on like more natural gas?
yeah, I think that it's going to be tough for me. You know, the good news is that there are a lot of studies that say if you keep renewables, certainly if you keep renewables in the range they are today, that you don't have a lot of quote capacity problems, kind of reliability problems. As long as you don't have a region, a few of them where it's very, very high. Some of this renewables, keep in mind, this is about 10, maybe 8, 9, 10% of this, 42% or 21% is hydro. So that's a little more reliable, right? I mean, it's typically one river hydro or a few of the dams that are left in the US, which mostly on the river. And it just is reliable, except you look at the data for Western hydro the last couple of years, not so good, right? So not totally reliable. Still rather have a fossil plant in that case for reliability purposes. So it's a little less of a challenge than it might look like in this chart, because this is renewables plus hydro. Assuming it does start to rain again in the Pacific Northwest, which I think it will. California, not so clear. I think that it is still going to be a challenge. You start pushing 20, 25, 30%, then you really better have a lot of cheap battery storage options. And one thing that's kind of interesting is, maybe the good news is, as we shift more to solar versus wind, and that's generally projections that there be more central stations, solar is built than wind. Well, in the last decade, it was all more wind than solar. Solar is a little bit more friendly towards a battery solution. Why? Well, think about how solar works, right? Operates during the day, use the battery, keep some of the excess power, and then use it in the evening. And you have continuing load at the sunset, right? Then, you know, it's hard to think of a battery solution for wind that really works, right? Because if you have a wind plant and what you're worried about are those couple of days in a row, maybe 3 or 4 days, middle of summer, then it stops blowing, just dies, right? But you might have 60 days before that where it's blowing, right? So what are you gonna do? How are you gonna store that power in a battery? Are you gonna start storing it the first day the wind's blowing or the second day? You're gonna keep it in the battery all that time? The economics, if you start thinking about it, just doesn't make as much sense. Okay. Well, that is all I've got. So, the next week we have the video on energy. We try to talk and say. Thanks. All right, welcome.